right, welcome back for another episode. I appreciate you hanging with us. My name is Bob Wyatt.
And I'm Todd Larsen.
Perfect. And today we wanted to talk a little bit about some of our readers' experiences, and really wanted to touch base on what the book is, what we intended by it. We've had a number of readers who read it and said they were pleasantly surprised that this was not what they were expecting when they picked it up. They thought they would get more of a light action adventure type of a story. And what they got was something very different, a much more deep dive into fantasy, a lot larger in scope, some heavy world building. And we're proud of what we have created. And I think most people have really enjoyed it. But but
Although
we wanted
certainly a
to
few that haven't enjoyed it.
yeah,
Maybe
certainly.
we're
But
expecting the fast-paced action adventure and
yeah,
not prepared for what they were actually jumping into, and
yeah, that's fair.
that wasn't for everybody. So uh,
No, we realized this isn't everyone's cup of tea, and we wanted to talk about what we were intending when we created The Storm Beneath the Glass, and what to expect when you open the pages of the book and start reading chapters 1 through 60, and what it takes to get through everything, and really what you should expect as you get into the pages. So without further ado, Todd, why don't you get us started,
yeah,
and we'll go from there.
so I think our writing and what we've intended has evolved over time, um, in part because when we first started writing, when we were brand new at this, uh, we we were focused on just an awesome, cool story that cool things happen, and it's just sort of a light escapism, fun story, uh,
Yep.
and that changed over time as we got older and became maybe more exposed to the world at large through our adulthood, came to realize how much more complex and challenging the world could be. Writing an escapist fun adventure didn't sound as appealing to us, so we and we really wanted to explore much more themes of deep philosophy, theology,
Hmm.
politics, sociology, psychology. Like there a deep dive on some of the really more profound aspects
Yeah.
of human existence, set in a hopefully entertaining, but much more deliberate type of story than you might expect if
Yeah.
you're just getting cool plot.
I think that there's a place for the lighthearted action adventure stories that you can just turn your brain off and sit back and enjoy for a couple of hours, or right before bedtime or whatever. I don't, this isn't meant to disparage anybody that has written those types of stories. I think there's a valid place for that. Um, I also think that as we have grown, our ability to tell stories and the stories we really like and enjoy have probably shifted over time, and I think everybody goes through that. As we grow, we appreciate different things about storytelling. This is more of a slower burn than some of those lighthearted action adventures we were talking about. It's definitely more of a deep dive, and I think you're right. There are uh, some heavy philosophical questions that we wanted to address in our writing. One of the things that I really love about fantasy is the ability to address some things that might otherwise be sensitive or difficult to talk about. I think fantasy and science fiction offers a unique medium to be able to pull that off without having to deal with all of the baggage that Earth brings with it. And that's something I think we've embraced wholeheartedly as we've gone into this part of storytelling.
And maybe at a very high level, what are some of the difficult themes that we tackled, do you think, in the book that fantasy gives us some advantage. So, for example, we tackle slavery as an issue. We show different
Yep.
forms of it. That can be a very sensitive issue. It's a problem that we still face in modern times here on Earth, let
Oh yeah,
alone the United States
in
history
spades.
with chattel slavery
Yeah.
and uh, other, I mean, it's a fact throughout almost all of human history. There's been practically no time or place in Earth's history until very like recently that slavery has begun to be eradicated, and plenty of
Or at
places where
least
it hasn't.
shunned. Yeah, the form of slavery, and this is something we'll probably get into in a whole separate video. So
Sure.
I don't want to do a deep dive into that. But you know, I think slavery today has a different form, right?
Right.
And what we call slavery is repulsive and pretty much universally reviled throughout the Western world. However, there are plenty of places that slavery still exists and has taken different forms, and unfortunately, we're uncomfortably blind to that in our world today. But we've jumped into that, and it takes a number of different forms throughout the series, and you can see that the 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 morality behind the cultural aspects of different forms of that in our world, and it makes it, because it's not tied to real world things, it makes it a little bit easier to have that discussion.
Well, and
And
we show some people who appreciate and like their form of slavery. Uh,
yeah,
the among the Vanassi, a group that you'll
hmm,
run into in the book, the form that they practice, uh, not lifelong chattel slavery, right? Something maybe more akin to indentured servitude, but
right,
they like the system, or at least you're introduced to some characters who like the system, who live within that system, who have been subject to it uh,
hmm,
as the slaves, if you will, who say this is a good system for us, and we wanted, like with religion or many of the other topics that we cover, we want to represent perspectives that think about it differently. We don't want to say
right,
slavery is wrong, and everyone in our book who talks about it, if if it's at all approving of slavery, they're evil, and only the good people and every good person has to hate it.
hmm,
That's fine for Earth, maybe, but I think there are some interesting things that we can explore in the way people relate to it. And so slavery is just one example, and it's not even by any means
yeah.
the biggest example. It's relatively small, actually, in the book, but it's one of a handful of topics that are really
Well,
challenging.
and I think we could look at authoritarianism. Certainly,
Yeah,
we
absolutely.
address that, or certain forms of government. We uh, is a monarchy and absolute power good or bad? What are the dangers of other aspects of social governance? Um, we might find places where you've got more of an oligarchy or more of other types of rule, and by putting it in a fantasy setting, you're taking it out of the real world and taking out some of those personal feelings. We do the same thing with religion, and we're able to address those things. What is your moral responsibility to society? Um, you know, I've enjoyed exploring a lot of those ideas. Uh, Again, through that neutral lens of being a different world.
Yeah. Well, and I guess two additional things. One is um, we don't ever try to make commentary on any particular nation or religion or anything like we don't have parallels in our fictitious world.
Yeah.
to any real world specific religions or government organizations or states or anything
Or
like
at
that.
least, yeah, at least we've consciously tried to avoid parallels.
Yeah,
I do think that there's probably plenty of people that will read into this their perspective, and that's valid, or they may see that we have parallels that we didn't intend, also valid.
sure.
Some of those maybe them projecting on us, and some of us that may be our own biases creeping in. And we can do the best job we can of filtering those out. And I really think we've done an excellent job there. However, we're not blind to the fact that some of our opinions will creep through, but we've also tried to consciously show things from an opinion-free perspective as much as we could.
Yeah,
And I think we've done a strong job of that.
agreed. Now, the question I guess we should answer is, so the fact that we focus so heavily on these deep topics in the book, what impact does that have on the reader experience? Like, what should they
Yeah.
be expecting going in reading this? Because not everyone wants to pick up a book that is a blend of
Yeah.
fantasy and philosophy, or and the other topics that subject areas that we try to cover.
Yeah, when I've told friends this is a heavier novel than they're probably used to, that's partly a joke on the weight of the book because it's not a small book. But I do tell them it deals with some heavy philosophical ideas, but we've tried to make this to where it's also accessible, that you can learn about it, read about the world that we've created, um, and get a feel for the issues fairly easily. It takes time. It's a big story, and I think it's an important story. Um, but I don't think, even if somebody is mildly interested, if all they want is a lightweight uh, fireside reading for a little bit and then go back to their regular life, that's fine. This probably isn't the book that's going to fill that need for them.
Yeah.
And so I need to be honest and say, not for everyone. But I do think there's a lot of people out there that are mildly interested, and as they read, they'll become more interested, and it might start discussions that they find they've been missing, and that's okay. We mentioned this when we were talking about world building religions, that we hope that this will generate more discussion about religion, and maybe can provide a safe outlet for them to do so without feeling tied to Earth's religions. But I also think that there's a lot of philosophical questions that this might cause people to explore a little bit more, or be curious about, or maybe that's further discussions that we can have together,
Yeah.
and especially that we can have with readers.
No.
And that's part of my hope. So it doesn't have to be only for people who really want that heavy philosophical book, because I don't think everybody sees it as a heavy philosophical book.
Right.
I think there are themes in there that are like that, but we've tried to write it also to where if you just want a story, I mean, I've had young adults read the book and enjoy it too, and become fascinated by it. And I think there are things that might have gone over their heads. I know I read things, and there are things that go over my head. So that's okay.
Yeah, I mean,
but my hope is that it opens up doors and minds.
My 14-year-old daughter's reading it right now, and she's about 2/3 of the way through the book, or maybe a little bit more. Actually, she's been reading it pretty quickly, and I know there's plenty in there that she doesn't get. She doesn't have the education or the development yet, the life experience to pick up on some of the stuff that we tackle in there, and yet she enjoys it because it's, I think, a compelling story. So two comments, I guess I would say. One, you don't need to have a background in, like, you don't need a philosophy degree or a history degree or a literary analysis degree, or even have graduated high school yet, or even entered high school yet, to necessarily enjoy the book. We tried to write it so that there's plenty in there in terms of the story for everyone to enjoy on a story basis. But if all you're interested in is the story, there's probably going to be a lot in there that feels slow because we take the time to develop some themes that people are like, oh, why are you showing two people lighting a fire while they're camping? Well, it doesn't advance the plot at all. What it
Yep.
does is it shows one particular character's approach to leadership and mentoring, which is one of the themes in our book. And if you're just moving from one rapid scene of action to another,
Yeah.
slowing down and taking the time to show in the quiet moments where mentoring can really happen and developing that relationship can happen, we think it would be doing short shrift. So maybe some people are like, you guys spend way too much time focused on these weird things that don't have anything to do with the plot. Yeah, fair enough. It's happening as the plot is moving forward, but there's definitely material that we include to develop other themes that are not strictly advancing the plot. Hopefully those don't get too bogged down. We've had to delete a lot of stuff that we originally wrote in, but
Yeah.
and we've tried to make the story pacing work well to keep the plot moving forward and keeping, hit action often enough and all those story beats. And that was a lot of the work that we did in the rewriting, which I think every author, no matter what they're trying to accomplish, has to scrutinize everything that they write and say, is this
Yep.
serving my purpose? And I guess the only point is that our purpose is different than maybe a lot of other fantasy books, and readers should be prepared for material that is hitting multiple purposes, unlike a lot of other fantasy maybe.
Yeah, and I would also add to that I've had some folks that have asked, do I have to really be into fantasy to get this? Because I do mention it's a pretty heavy epic fantasy series, and that's our intent. That was by design. And my answer to them is almost always no. We've tried to make it accessible, even if you're not heavily into fantasy. This is a fantasy series, and it's an epic fantasy by genre, and we do a deep dive into the world that we've created, and there's politics and there's religion and there's plenty going on. However, uh, we've tried to spell that out for the reader in a measured approach so that we're not just info dumping everything at once. We don't have to have preconceived ideas about fantasy characters, abilities, magic systems, things like that. We've tried to explain all of that as we've gone so that even if you're not heavily into fantasy, that this is accessible. Partly because I would love more people to get into the genre. I love fantasy, always have, and I've seen it as a gateway into some really beautiful conversations, and that's part of why we made the book the way we did.
Yeah.
We wanted to start meaningful conversations, and we've used fantasy as an avenue to do that because I think it's one of the best avenues out there to be able to have those conversations.
Um, Although I will say we've had reader feedback. Some of the feedback we've gotten is, hey, for anyone out there who's considering getting into fantasy, this may not be the book for you to start getting into fantasy. And I mean, fair enough.
That's fair.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It may not be your intro to fantasy.
I think
book.
you can certainly do it, but it would be easier later in life. As an introduction to fantasy, than if I was introducing a young adult to fantasy.
Yeah,
There
might be
plenty of
if you're looking
other
to
avenues out there to get into it.
Yeah, if you're looking to transition from Brothers Karamazov or War and Peace over into fantasy, this may be the bridge for you. But
yeah,
probably not.
Yeah, but it's
probably not from I don't know.
It's
Go ahead.
It's not a Marvel movie,
right?
But like I said, it's got a lot of meaningful themes to it by intention, and I think that as people get into it, you'll have those themes, and like I said, my hope is that it'll cause conversations to be had between readers. That would be lovely.
So besides the deep themes, what are some
Mm-hmm.
other stylistic choices that you and I made in writing the book that is maybe sets us apart from other fantasy writers?
There's I think there's a lot of them we can touch on. We intentionally wanted to make longer chapters. I feel like by having those chapters longer and having multiple points of view, you get a little bit more of a deep dive into what that character is thinking, where they stand, a little bit of the behind the scenes with that particular character. I like long form conversations. If I'm listening to a conversation, I don't like to listen to a 5 minute interview. I like to listen to the hour-long interviews.
Yeah.
And so we've intentionally made our chapters longer. A lot of books that I've read, even fantasy books in the last 10 years, have had very short chapters that have tried to keep the pace moving along. That's fine too. We've had a little bit more measured approach, and we wanted to have those longer chapters. I mean, there was a while, Todd, that you were joking that you wanted to have every chapter 20 pages and have 50 chapters in the book, and that symmetry was there. And I'll admit there were times when I was tempted to go down that road too, but
Yeah.
but obviously we end the chapter where it needs to end. But we don't have short, snippy chapters. There are times when we might have a slight break in a chapter to uh, to carry on with that person's point of view after an event has happened, but it's pretty rare. Most of it you get to sit behind the scenes with a particular character for a good stretch of time.
Yeah. And
Um, that that was intentional.
I would also say another thing, just to take it all like down to sort of one of the more granular levels, from our word
Yeah.
choice to our sentence structures. Like we had this conversation with our editor, Stacy. Uh, she
Yes.
recognized pretty early in the first chapter or two our writing style might be off-putting or unpleasant to some people who want a short, clippy, move quickly through everything. And she was breaking sentences apart to make them more digestible, maybe. But we considered her potential edits, but in a lot of cases we went back to a more complex sentence structure because from a pacing standpoint, within the way the words flow on the page, we like I as a reader, I like to read more complex sentence structures, like holding a clause and then having a sub clause and then
Yeah.
going back with another clause that picks up from the main one. Like Tolkien did this a lot, and I loved it. I loved the average words
Now,
per sentence
in
much
saying
longer.
all of that, Todd, you just lost 90% of all of our readers.
Probably. And
But I do think that our readers, I think readers in general, not just ours, they can handle longer sentences and complex sentences. I think sometimes we write, or we tend to think we need to write at a much lower level than people actually understand and can move with.
or can
And
enjoy.
that
Yeah.
longer I think that longer sentence structure can be satisfying too. And it doesn't all have to be written at a certain grade level. We can elevate the writing and people still understand and get it. And if there is somebody that's on the edge of this, helps them get to that next level of reading and comprehension. I just don't think it's as big of a deal, that it's a little bit more complicated as far as the writing style goes. I think our readers and other readers that may not even be interested in our stuff, they can handle this. This isn't an obstacle.
Yeah. I will say most of our chapters, taking it because you mentioned chapter length,
Yeah.
most of our chapters do not start with action, right? There is
Yeah.
there is some groundwork to be laid for what the POV character is feeling, what they're experiencing. Maybe there's some initial context that we actually show, rather than jumping in closer to the action and needing to tee up what is going on.
Yeah.
We just show the lead up. So uh, a lot of our chapters have a pretty slow ramp rate initially, and maybe some minor peak interest along the way. Something interesting happens, a slight increase in the action, but then there's kind of a overall a slower slope. But most of our chapters end on something that drives the plot forward, often with a hook.
Yeah.
And we have a few chapters that are action right from the beginning, like we drop you in right as the action is beginning, or something.
Those are definitely the exception.
Those are the exception. Most of our chapters have a slow beginning and then ramp up pretty quickly towards the end. And
part of that, I think, is intentional, because we wanted the action to be meaningful. We wanted it to be intentional. There are a few cases where a surprise happens and the action is there.
Right.
But in most cases, we're showing that lead up. And even in the surprise cases, we're showing the events before, so it becomes as a surprise to the reader as well. And if the characters are surprised, I would hope that the readers are also.
Yeah, we've talked about this before, but George R.R. Martin in the Game of Thrones series, Song of Ice and Fire, he was a master at chapter pacing, like within a chapter.
Yeah, 100% agree.
And he often did this where there was a lot of information happening that's like, I don't know, this isn't terribly exciting in the moment. It's interesting. It keeps your, the plot's moving forward, or you're starting to understand a bigger piece of the puzzle. But then there's always some twist or hook or acceleration in some action that leaves you like, wait, what? Where did that come from? And then you're like, oh my gosh, I want to see what happens next. And then you're on to a different chapter. And he always ends these chapters on these really high peak points that I just think is masterful. And so I don't know how masterfully everyone thinks we did at this, but that was a lot of the time what we were trying to emulate, is that sense of serious resolution. There's a climax in each chapter that leaves you hopefully wanting to move forward into the next chapter.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
The other thing I would mention, and it's certainly not a big thing, as we were writing it, we originally had all of these action scenes. We had these cool things we wanted, when we were younger. And we recognized that, action for the sake of action, while exciting, it's not meaningful. And if we're trying to tell something that's meaningful, something that sparks a conversation, the action scenes need to be driving that also. Yeah. And they can't be just there as a break from. So a lot of the action scenes are centered around, some heavier themes. We didn't pull punches with some of the action scenes. There are some, and not that they're gruesome. I actually don't think that we got particularly graphic in our book or in our storytelling. However, we also didn't pull punches, and there are some things and tragedies that happen from time to time. That's part of action. This isn't an action hero story where the hero is practically untouchable. There are injuries that happen. There are consequences to most of the action.
Although I will say, some readers have given us feedback that they were surprised at the body horror, and that was even a new term to me. Like, I was like, body? What are you talking about?
Oh,
and and then I came to realize what they were talking about. It took me by surprise. Like, we don't have any body horror. And then they're like, well, what about this? Oh, well.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
well,
I guess.
Except for that.
And what about this chapter, arms and legs? It's like, well, yeah, that's pretty gross. Like, there's things throughout there. So again,
there are disturbing concepts that are certainly addressed, and some of them are on that body horror scale.
Yeah,
without a doubt.
I don't think we describe anything graphically like, again, I was comfortable with my 14-year-old daughter reading it. I
Yeah.
was much more concerned with her comprehension level for the difficulty
Yep.
level of the book, much more than anything in the book that I was concerned about for her reading level or
True,
maturity.
but for instance, to give you an example, writing any scene where they were dealing with the bonded, my stomach was a little bit uneasy. I mean,
That's one of the places.
yeah, and it's a little bit
So
stomach
so
churning to deal with
the
that.
bonded, for anyone who wants to know,
Yeah.
is there are magic users in our book. They're called Elentier, who um, it's a rare technology in the world, but they, in order to have long distance communication, they can split a human being in half, sort of this way. I don't know, some medical person probably has a word for that, but anyway, right and left, not across the waist, up and
Yeah.
down, and they bond each half of the body to a particular type of crystalline stone, a large crystal that is able to maintain the body as being alive, and then you can ship the two halves to different places, and
Right.
you can communicate with the people on each end holding the bonded, and so you have to have,
Because it's still one being,
it's one being,
just split in two, you're actually able to channel through the being to the other side where that other half is.
right?
The soul, it's almost like the soul is still whole, but the body is halved, and so the communication can exist between the two. And it is, I mean, it's disturbing to
To
describe.
imagine, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and so yeah, and these are things that are entered into voluntarily or not. We haven't seen everything in the world
Right.
yet, but it's yeah. When I was writing those, every time, how could that become normal to view? So you're seeing characters. Some of them aren't used to seeing that, and some of them are. That this is not that big of a deal. This is part of what they deal with on a semi-regular basis, and other characters are very uncomfortable around it. And I would have been the latter.
Yeah. So another stylistic choice that we made was um, introducing new point of view characters later in the book than probably a lot of other
Yeah,
writers would. I think it's we introduce an entirely new storyline halfway through the book, which was a decision that we struggled with a bit. There's a reason we chose to do it that way. It wasn't just, you know, randomly we stuck in
yeah,
this side story.
and I think most readers so far have understood the reason and have not took issue with that. I was actually probably more worried than I should have been about it, because it's unconventional to have a new plot line starting midway through.
Well, we've had
But
a couple of readers
we've
say
only
they
had a
almost put the book down and didn't finish because
yeah,
it was so off-putting.
but only a couple,
Only a
which was
couple. I
surprising.
think the
I thought
majority.
there
Yeah,
would be more.
I agree. But the recognizing the risk that could be very off-putting and just interrupt the pacing of the story, we chose to move forward with that for reasons that will become apparent as you read. So I don't want to spoil anything, but um, we've tried to be very deliberate and intentional about everything that we did. Now, maybe we're just unskilled writers or storytellers or something, and everyone's like, sure, you can be deliberate about it. It's just that your decision is terrible, right? Like that's, I'm sure,
Right.
possible. So far, on the whole, I think we haven't heard that from too many people. Most people who get past, let's say, the first 10 chapters or 15 chapters or something, end up finishing the book and reading it. I haven't yet come across anyone who's like, yeah, I got to chapter 25 and I just couldn't finish the book, right? Like that just doesn't happen. So now
Right.
that's a lot of pages because our chapters are like 15 to 20
Yeah, without
pages.
a doubt.
So that just may be too much of an investment for some people who are like, I'm not feeling connected to the story yet. Fair enough. Like we knew that was a risk, but okay. So can we pivot to one other, not one other, but slightly off of this topic? to um, what what have you noticed in terms of themes from our readers? Because I don't like we love our book. We think it's great, obviously. We've probably had
Well,
feedback from, I don't know, 20-ish people, 25 people, something like that so far. Have you noticed themes from readers on what things they're enjoying or what things might be more difficult for them?
well, I've a lot of them have been fascinated with the world and the level of detail it feels lived in, and that's been something that they've really loved. There have been a few that have felt like it was a little too much or off-putting, but for the most part, I think it's been fairly positive from that side of things. One of the themes that I think had come up a couple of times, that in mostly in conversations, not so much in the written feedback that we've received, has been a few sensitive scenes that we had about either characters that were they made morally questionable choices or comments, or in one case we deal with some sexual harassment, not sexual abuse, but certainly inappropriate behavior by a superior to somebody else. And that was I think you and I both had the same experience. That was some of the hardest portions to write.
Why
and
was it
try to,
difficult?
well, I mean, you want to, you don't want to gross anybody out. People have experienced this before, so you don't want to trigger them,
Right.
and cause them to have that feeling of revulsion and uh, not want to continue. You also want to be fair. You don't want to sugarcoat it. You don't want to treat it lightly. And with that particular scene, I think we felt like we had a responsibility to make sure that it was called out, to make sure that it had impact on the character, and also we wanted to leave it a little bit open ended. There was no resolution per se to that.
At least not in book one.
That's Yeah, on it in the story that you're going
Yeah.
to read with The Storm Beneath the Glass.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's not a lot of resolution there. There's something that happens, and there's stuff that happens after that. And when it is brought to light a little bit, certainly there's others that react to it, I think appropriately, but we were intentional in making sure that it's not like something happens, they're called out, it's resolved on the spot, and characters move on. People are dealing with it for a while afterwards.
Yeah, and the reason I think we felt compelled to include it is, we've seen throughout history, but I mean, maybe more intensively over the last 2 to 3 decades, with the Catholic Church sex scandal, the Boy Scouts of America, child abuse accusations,
and there will be others,
the LDS churches. Yeah, like
by the time people read this, or hear this,
unfortunately, and so
I wish that wasn't.
People, as we said in our last podcast episode, people in every system do terrible things and do wonderful good things. There's a mix, and we're trying to tackle in a realistic way, in a deep way, what it looks like, what it means to grapple with questions of your faith. And one of those things that is challenging to a lot of people is when church leaders, people in authority within a church, although it doesn't have to be church, it can be any system, abuse their power or make decisions that most people would find morally objectionable. And how does that leave other people to think about the religion or the whatever the institution is that that person belongs to? Should the institution itself sort of carry the sins of its members who do terrible things? And I mean,
Yeah, we actually address that in a number of different ways. This
right.
is
This is
one
just
of
one of
those.
them.
But I think as the series goes on, we'll see that in just about every organization.
Yeah. And so this was just one of those things. So, but we also tackle other things. Like I was in a writing seminar, a class a couple of years ago, and the guy who was a very successful author was teaching the class, was talking about giving your main character, your protagonist, flaws and how to go about doing that, why you should give your main character flaws. Otherwise, they feel flat and uninteresting.
Yeah.
And I asked him, what about moral flaws? And he was like, well, you really shouldn't give your main character moral flaws. Give them something like a learning disability
Yeah.
or a physical handicap or, something like that, some trauma that, affects them. Just don't give them any moral flaws. It's like, what kind of, like,
Yep.
I obviously, because of our book, disagree with that. Like, everyone has flaws, including moral flaws. There's no one who's not morally flawed. So if you don't have a main character who's morally flawed, they're not a realistic character. So our main
Well,
characters.
the other thing is, don't you want to show them overcoming those moral flaws? I mean, part of my frustration is when you have a trend in writing where they don't give main characters moral flaws, they're only overcoming external
Right.
obstacles.
Right.
They need to be able to overcome themselves.
Or not, and suffer the consequence of that. Like that,
absolutely.
Like there's value in showing even your
Yeah.
protagonists having moral shortcomings that they never
Yeah, without a
overcome,
doubt.
and they pay a price for that, right? It
Mhm.
affects relationships, it closes opportunities, it people turn against you, whatever. Like it, not every hero is morally flawless, and
Yeah.
not every hero overcomes every flaw that they have, right? Like,
In fact, I think in today's day and age, don't we learn the opposite? That every hero we've had has had moral flaws. I mean, we can look at heroes from history
right.
who I adore, and yeah, but they did this. Yep, they did.
Right.
Like, when the time came, they did the right thing.
Right.
They, and it doesn't matter where you're at or what nationality. Every hero we're looking at, if you do a deep dive enough, you'll understand they're hero, but they're human.
Yeah.
And
even someone like Gandhi,
flaws.
Right? Like,
yeah,
he did some
things. But he was, yep, yes, he was.
He did some things that were like, I think most people would find morally objectionable today.
Sure.
Right? Like,
by today's standard, certainly.
Well, I mean, even at the time, it was probably considered questionable. Maybe not, probably not as much as in modern Western society. I think Gandhi would be excoriated by, most people today for some of the things that he did that people would find morally objectionable. Does that belittle or diminish the great value that he brought as a teacher of peaceful
but look
resistance?
at what he did with society.
Amazing.
Absolutely. And I think we can point to a dozen examples throughout history of that.
So I again, tackling these difficult questions and giving our characters, like, some of the criticism we've got is some of your main characters have misogynistic views or have racist views or are elitist and have despicable classist views. Yes, that's absolutely right. That wasn't an accidental, like, reflection of our own, secret misogyny or racism or whatever. Yeah, those were all extremely deliberate choices that we struggled on. What should be the flaws? How much should we show it? How quickly should we show them overcoming? How quickly should they suffer consequences? You obviously don't always know what the consequences are going to be, and sometimes they're subtle, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like someone who, I'm just going to take misogyny as an example. Someone who's misogynistic, but extremely charismatic, and powerful and influential or rich or whatever, can get away with that for quite a long time, potentially their whole
Yeah.
life, right? Because they have the power, the means to manage
Yeah.
the negative consequences to a greater extent
Better than yeah,
than a
better
lot
than
of other
most.
people. Yeah. And
Yeah.
but it always comes back to this is the thing. You can never truly escape the consequences of who you are. It if you're that way, and unless everyone else around you is the same way, in which case that's the norm of society, and you could criticize it, but at least within a given social context, if you're following the norms of society, you're not going to suffer any consequences within society. But to the extent that your behavior is out of sync with the norms
Yeah.
of your society, of your culture, you are going to pay a price for it no matter what. And even some, well, anyway, I don't want to go too far down the philosophy. I think the point is that to show some of those subtle consequences, you can't
Mm-hmm.
do that through fast paced, plucky action. You have to show
Yeah.
that playing out in subtle tension between characters that pops up in seemingly unrelated ways. But as you begin to see that happen in multiple settings, you can then, the pattern arises, and
Yep.
we don't want to force feed that into any of our readers' experience, but we provide plenty of material for people to begin to see those patterns and consequences for themselves. And then it gives you an opportunity to reflect on, am I seeing any of those patterns in my own life? Maybe not through
Right.
misogyny exactly, as that was my example, but maybe you have some other viewpoint that others find morally repugnant, and
Yeah.
I was about to really go down a rabbit hole. Anyway, to keep it short, you can see through the characters in the book experiencing these negative externalities. You can say, wait a minute, I'm seeing similar patterns in my own life.
Yeah.
I
Do
need to
I
find
do
out
I say
why.
things like that?
Yes, exactly. So that's
You know,
that's not going to happen in a really fast-paced, plucky, movie. I mean,
well,
book.
if you try to make it fast paced, it's disingenuous,
Yeah,
and it doesn't
yeah.
really respect the subject matter. You know, I think another one that, because you'd asked about themes that reviewers or readers have talked to us about. One of the big ones that I've had personal discussions about has been mental health and our depictions of mental health,
Yep.
because we also didn't want to skirt around those issues. We intentionally had some of our characters struggle with mental health, and some people understood that struggle, and some characters didn't understand that struggle. And so we've had a couple of cases where people have said, I like that you showed this. Um, I found myself getting frustrated with a particular character, and I recognize that I recognize where they're at and what they're struggling with, but it made them less likable. That's that
Absolutely
that's true.
valid. Yes. Yeah. And
And that was intentional. We wanted to show characters that were struggling with mental health at times. Not everyone. In fact, I would even say not most characters per se, but we do represent that, and we wanted to have that be not a temporary struggle. This is not something that they overcome in a chapter. It may last several chapters. It may last a lot longer than that.
several books.
That's how mental health
Yeah.
works.
And it may come and
And as
go.
somebody who has struggled with depression, for instance,
Yeah.
that's not a quick fix. And sometimes there are external factors that kick it off. Often those external factors go away, and you're still struggling, and that doesn't make a lot of sense. So we wanted to be genuine in our depiction of struggles with mental health, and that did mean we debated at length. Okay, how do we show this? When do we show a resolution? It's gone on for several chapters. It feels like it's dragging. Should we cut it off? And those are valid those are valid questions any author would ask. And I think that what we were trying to do is strike that balance of how do we be respectful and show an actual mental health struggle and not make light of it by making it easy and making it quick, but also not make it so heavy that the reader doesn't want to carry on
Right.
with the characters. And that was a tricky balancing point that we had.
Yeah. I, I guess 2 points really quickly. One is it's been interesting that some people have expressed sort of the darker themes of the books.
Yeah.
It's that our book doesn't have an obvious happy ending, right? We it is not a
Yep.
standalone book. It doesn't have a climax. The hero doesn't win the day. That's not what this book is about. In book one, particularly, right? Like,
Yeah.
the,
A lot of the climaxes that happened are yes, but.
yeah, exactly.
And
Like one person was like, "That's it. That's the end of the book." Yep, read book two. Like, I don't know what to, and modern fantasy and maybe other genres as well. Um,
yeah,
so you're not getting picked up for as a debut author, especially. You're not getting picked up for a series of books. Like, the market for traditionally published books is just not there for
right.
publishers to want to pick up a book that doesn't work as a standalone book, where you get to the end and you're just, the only place left to go is for book two. Like, the story continues, obviously, right? That's not the trend in traditional publishing
Right.
right now. And ours,
Which makes me think, how would Tolkien
yeah,
be received if his book were, I mean, if Fellowship of the Rings was published today, the ending of Fellowship is not the ending, because of course he's telling the Lord of the Rings.
right.
And in many ways and I'm not saying we are Tolkien. I'm not, I'm certainly not wanting to draw that parallel there, but in many ways we're telling the Ultideic Prophecies. The Storm Beneath the Glass is book one of that, but we didn't intend it to be all wrapped up in a bow and then we'd proceed with another book that's all wrapped up in a bow. This is a long story. There are climaxes that happen in each of.
So we had a little bit of a technical glitch, so we're picking it back up. But let's pick up with the question: have we gotten any feedback from readers about book one that is going to make us change either in our style or in the content of the books going forward, as we're currently writing book two?
Yeah, it's hard to say for certain what will change, because we've been evolving as the whole process has gone on, and I think this is just part of that process. However, the biggest change that I've noticed is that there are some certain elements of the story that I felt like we needed to hang on to and maybe reveal the end game later on in the series rather than right now. And as I've talked to people, I've recognized I probably need to move that time frame up. And there were a couple of things that we planned on slow rolling out and maybe really making some big reveals in book 3 or 4 that now we're looking at how do we fit that into book 2. And I think that it's helped us recognize that there are certain things that the reader, that I can connect because I see the big picture. The reader doesn't have that same big picture, and we need to make that connection for them in a little bit shorter time frame. So that's, I think, one of the big things for me that we've changed in our writing, and it's caused us to go back to that outline and make yet another round of changes.
Yeah, and I would also say, we have a lot of exposition in book one. We try not to do it. Exposition heavy
Yeah.
is boring reading for the most part.
Absolutely.
Everyone
Yeah.
knows that. We know that. There are some times where we felt that it was warranted, and we kept it in despite
Yep.
being tempted to cut it. Like, as an example, in chapter 2 of the book, we spend like 3 pages talking about Beric and Andric, how they met, and as Andric is on his way to meet Beric. Some people may feel like that's too much backstory to provide that early in the book. Find a way to handle it through dialogue, or the different writing techniques you have to avoid
Yeah.
exposition, but still provide the reader the context. And fair enough, maybe there would have been more artful ways to do some of that. What I've noticed so far, and we've said this before, earlier in the book, I mean, the first half of book one, certainly more exposition heavy than the second half of book one. Book two, so far, I've noticed, is even less exposition and maybe more what readers are expecting, although we're introducing some new characters. If you thought 8 POVs in book one was too many, I've got bad news for you. There's more. We get up to like 12 POV characters in book.
And some of those that we've added are characters that the reader already has met and just hasn't seen their POV yet.
Yeah.
Some of them are new.
Right. And anyway.
And obviously some of the POVs that we have, we may not be able to use in book two.
Right. So anyway, the point being that there are some things that readers have expressed as challenges that we're just not going to change what we're doing. It may get worse. We think it's a more interesting story, more well-rounded. There's reasons, like we struggled over every single POV that we add, and is it absolutely necessary? Is there another way to tackle the same questions through the existing POVs that we have? And where we didn't feel that was possible, we've added some POVs that can handle different aspects. But I think for me, one of the things that I'm most careful about in my writing, as a result of some of the feedback, is pacing, of the book, and not just through exposition, but there are always ideas that writers have that they love, and on a first draft, put down everything, just get the material out, and then go back and do the heavy lifting of cutting what isn't absolutely necessary. And maybe I'm going to be even more ruthless than I was. I felt like we cut so much of what we wrote. Yes, the book that we put out is way shortened down compared to all the material we originally wrote for it. What I will say is, as we found problems in the writing, we cut it, but then the holes that we were trying to fill with that terrible writing, we found better, more skillful ways of doing it, but that often required us adding in additional stuff. So our original manuscript was in the high 200,000 word count, and then we ended up at 352,000 word count. So the book got longer as we fixed the problems, because we didn't just cut it and leave the holes. We had to fill those in. And I think we won't have as much problem with that, where our story as we're writing it is already really quite tight, based on our outline and everything else. So I think the things people enjoy about our book will be even better.
Agreed.
But some of the criticisms will still be valid, and maybe that's just, go ahead.
But I think the pacing of book two hopefully will be more like the second half of book one. Most of that exposition you talked about is early, and I think as the book goes on, we're able to get away from that because we've already established the background, and it's not like there won't be any going forward. Every story has it. But I think that the pacing will be much closer to what we see in the second half of book one, and that's our goal.
But no less of the philosophy and theology and difficult topics, like all of those things. More of that. So anyway,
we're going to still encounter all of that and deal with the ramifications of all of the things that happen in book one, and in some cases the continuation.
So if there were themes or stylistic choices that we made that you may not have liked in book one, by all means, let us know. Drop it in the comments. We'd love to hear additional feedback
Yeah,
always.
please do.
And we'll look forward to talking to you guys next time.
Take care.